Slow Regard of Silent Things by Patrick Rothfuss. Chapter 2. What a Look Entails. The second day, Ari woke to a silence and the perfect dark. That meant a turning day. A doing day. Good. There was much to do before he came. She wasn't nearly ready. She roused Foxen and folded up her blanket, careful to keep the corners off the floor. She glanced around the room. Her box and leaf and lavender were fine. Her bed was fine. Everything was just as it should be. There were 3 ways out of Mantle. The hallway was for later. The doorway was for now. The door was oak, bound in iron. Ari did not look at it. In port, the stone figurine and the length of lace had made themselves at home. The brave Crystal was content in the wine rack. The armbone and linen sack were so comfortable you'd think they'd been there for 100 years. The old black buckle was crowding the resin a bit, but that was quickly mended. She nudged it to one side to keep things civilized. She looked around inside. Everything was fine except for the great brass gear. It exasperated her. She picked the crystal up and set it next to the gear, but that didn't help at all and just upset the crystal. It was brave enough for 10, but it wasn't for the corner table. She gave it a quick kiss by way of apology and returned it to the wine rack. Ari picked up the heavy gear with both hands and brought it into Mantle. It was unheard of, really, but at this point she was at something of a loss. She set it on the narrow ledge of stone on the wall opposite her bed. She tipped it so that the empty gap its missing tooth made was straight up towards the ceiling, as if it were reaching upwards with its 2 short, stubby arms. Stepping back, she looked at it inside. Better, but even so, it wasn't the proper place. Ari washed her face and hands and feet. Her thin sliver of soap smelled of sunlight. That made her smile. Then she slipped into her second favorite dress, as it had better pockets. It was a turning day, after all. In port, she put her linen gather sack over one shoulder, tucking a few things inside. Then she packed her pockets full as well. Before she left, Ari glanced back into Mantle at the brazen gear. But no. If it had wanted to come, it should have been content to stay in port. Pride thing. In Van, she was startled to find the mirror was unsettled, anxious even. Hardly an auspicious start to her day. Still, it was the sort of thing only a fool would willfully ignore, and Ari was no fool. Besides, the mirror had been around for quite a while, so she knew its little ways. It wanted moving, but it needed to be settled first. It needed to be comforted, coaxed. It needed covering. So, despite the fact that she was yet unbrushed, Ari gathered up Foxen and took the long way down to Wade's, walking carefully to her newly opened door as she eyed the frescoes overhead. She stopped briefly in the sitting room, looking around. The tiny wrongness was still there, like a hint of gristle in her teeth. It wouldn't bother her if everything else here wasn't almost perfect. But some things simply can't be rushed. Ari knew this for a fact. Besides, she needed the mirror set to rights before anything else. That meant covering. So she headed up the unnamed stair, her feet skipping back and forth to miss the unsafe stones. Then she headed through the broken wall and into Tumbrel. Once there, Ari opened up the wardrobe's drawer. She did not touch the sheets. Instead, her hands went into her pockets. She felt the smooth facets of the brave crystal. No. She touched the curved lines of the kind stone figurine. No. The flat black rock? No. Then her fingers touched the buckle, and she smiled. She brought it out and set it gently in the drawer. Then she lifted out the topmost folded sheet. It was smooth and creamy in her hands, pale as ivory. Ari stopped then, looking at the blackness of the buckle in the drawer. There was a stone in her stomach. and belong here. Oh, it seemed sensible. Oh, yes, certainly. But she knew what was seeming was worth in the end, didn't she? Reluctantly, she laid the sheet back in the drawer. Her fingers ran over its perfect whiteness, smooth and clean and new. There was a hint of winter in it. But no, there is a difference between the truth and what we wish were true. Sighing, Ari took the buckle back and pushed it deep into her pocket. Leaving the sheet where it was, Ari headed back to Mantle. She moved more slowly now, no skipping. The trip down the unnamed stair cheered her somewhat. Her path staggered drunkenly back and forth as she moved from one safe section to the other. A stone turned underfoot underneath her feet, and Ari pinwheeled her arms to keep from slipping. She cocked her head to one side, standing balanced on one foot. Was this place Tipple, then? No, it was too sly for that. The mirror was still restless back in Van, and with no better options, Ari was forced to fetch her blanket from her bed. Careful not to let it touch the ground, she draped it over the mirror before turning it to face the wall. Only then could it be moved across the room so that it stood before the bricked-over window where it so desperately wanted to be. She returned her blanket to Mantle and washed her face and hands and feet. Coming back to Van, she saw her time had been well spent. She had never seen her mirror so content. Grinning at herself, she brushed the elf knots from her hair until it hung around her like a golden cloud. But just as she was finishing, when she lifted up her arms to push her cloud of hair behind her, Ari staggered a bit, all sudden dizzy. After a pass, she walked slowly to Cricklet and took a long, deep drink. She felt the cool water run along her insides with nothing to stop it. She felt hollow inside. Her stomach was an empty fist. Her feet wanted to go to Apple Court, but she knew there were no apples left. He wouldn't be waiting there anyway. Not until the 7th day, which was good, really. She had nothing suitable to share, nor nothing halfway good enough to be a proper gift. So she went to Tree instead. Her pans were hanging in their proper places, her spirit lamp just so. The cracked clay cup was sitting quietly. Everything was just as it should be. That said, she had more tools than food in Tree. On the shelves there was the sack of salt he'd given her. There were 4 flat figs, swaddled modestly in a sheet of folded paper. A single, lonely, withered apple. A handful of dried peas sat sadly at the bottom of a clear glass jar. Set into the stone counter was a chill well, running with a slow but constant stream of icy water. It was keeping nothing cool save for a lump of yellow butter, and that was full of knives, scarcely fit for eating. On the counter was a fine and wondrous thing, a silver bowl, all brimming full of nutmeg pitums. Round and brown as smooth as river stones, they had come visiting from long-off lands. They filled the air, almost singing of their far away. Ari eyed them longingly and ran her fingertips along the edge of the silver bowl. It was etched with twining leaves. But no, rare and lovely as they were, she did not think they would be good for eating. Not now, at any rate. In that way, they were like the butter, not food exactly. They were mysteries that wished to bide their time in Tree. Ari climbed onto the stone counter so she could reach the apple where it perched up high upon its shelf. Then she sat next to the chill well, cross-legged, back straight, and cut the apple into 7 equal pieces before eating it. It was leathery and full of autumn. After that, she was still hungry, so she brought down the paper and laid it in front of herself, unfolding it carefully. Then she ate 3 of the figs, taking dainty bites and humming to herself. By the time she finished, her hands weren't shaking anymore. She wrapped the single fig up and set it on the shelf, then climbed down to the floor. She cupped some of the water from the well and drank it. She grinned. It gave her belly shivers. After eating, Ari knew it was past time she found the brazen gear its proper place. She tried to flatter it at first. Using both hands, she set it carefully on top of the mantelpiece beside her box of stone. It ignored the compliment and simply sat there, not one bit more forthcoming than it had been before. Sighing, Ari picked it up with both hands and carried it to Umbral, but it wasn't happy in amongst the ancient barrels there. Neither did it want to rest in Cricklet near the stream. She carried it through all of Dark House, setting it on every windowsill, but none of them suited it in the least. Arms growing sore from the weight of it, Ari tried to be irritated, but she couldn't stay angry. The gear was unlike anything she had ever seen before in all her years below. Just looking at it made her happy, and heavy as it was a joy to touch. It was a sweet thing, a silent bell that struck out love. All the while she carried it, it sang through her fingers of the secret answers that it held. No, she couldn't be angry. It was doing everything it could. It was her own fault for not knowing where it belonged. Answers were always important, but they were seldom easy. She would simply have to take her time and do things in the proper way. Just to be sure, Ari carried the gear back to where she'd found it. She'd be sad to see it go, but sometimes there was nothing else to do. Some things simply were too true to stay. Some merely came to visit for a while. As Ari stepped inside the arcing darkness of the Great 12, Foxen's light stretched up towards the unseen ceiling. His calm green glow reached out between the pipes that tangled on the walls. This was a different place today. That was its nature. Even so, Ari knew that she was welcome here, or if not welcome, at least indifferently ignored. Ari made her way further into the room, where the deep black water of the pool lay smooth as glass. Carefully, she set the bright gear upright on the stone edge of the pool. The gap from its broken tooth faced upward at an angle. She took a step back and covered Foxen with one hand. There was nothing but the dim gray light from the grate above. The gear was nowhere near as shimmering as it had been before. She eyed it closely for a breathless moment and tilted to one side. Then she grinned. It didn't want to leave. That, at least, was clear. She picked it up and tried it on the narrow ledge above the pool beside her bottles, but it simply sat there, all aloof, coruscant with answers, taunting her. Ari sat cross-legged on the floor and tried to think of what other place might fit the brazen gear. Mandrill? Candlebear? She heard a hush of feather in the air. Wings beat hard, then stopped. Looking up, Ari saw the shape of a nightjar outlined against the dull gray circle of light entering the grate high above. The bird struck something hard against the pipe, then ate it. A snail, she guessed. There was no need to guess the type of pipe, though. The ting of it let Ari know that it was iron, black, and twice the thickness of her thumb. The nightjar tapped the pipe again, and dipped down to the pool to drink. After it drank, the bird winged back quickly to its previous perch, back to the pipe, back to stand in the center of the dim gray light. It tapped a third and final time. Ari's gut went cold. She sat up straight and eyed the bird intently. It stared back at her for a long moment, then flew away, having done what it had come to do. She looked after it numbly, the chill in her gut making a slow knot. She couldn't ask for things to be more clear than that. Her pulse began to hammer at her then, her palms all sudden sweat. She took off running and was gone a dozen steps before she remembered herself and hurried back. Embarrassed by her rudeness, she gave the brazen gear a kiss so that it would know she wasn't leaving it. She would go back. Then she turned and sprinted off, first to Mantle, where she washed her face and hands and feet. She took a handkerchief out of her cider box and pulled it down through Rubric and Downing's to Burrow. Breathing hard, she finally stood before the unassuming wooden door that had to tenants. Her gut all sour and chill with fear, Ari looked around the edges of the door and relaxed to see faint cobweb there. There is still time. Perhaps. She pressed her ear against the wood and listened a long moment. Nothing. She slowly pulled it open. Standing anxious in the doorway, Ari peered into the dusty room. She eyed the cobwebs hanging from the ceiling. She eyed the table strewn with dusty tools. She eyed the shelves packed with bottles, boxes, and tin containers. She eyed the other door across the room. There was no hint of light around its edges. Ari did not like it here. It was not the underthing. This was a between place. It was not for her. But as much as she did not like it, the other options were all worse. She eyed the floor, covered with a fine layer of dust except for a set of heavy boot prints, black smudges scuffing through the gray dust on the floor. Boot prints told a story. They entered from the other door, moved from a table to a nearby shelf, and made a line to the doorway where she stood. She glared at the spot where they crossed the threshold. As they left the dusty door of tenants, the boot prints became invisible. They were from long ago, but even now the sight made her heart thump. Her skin was all hot prickle, indignant at the thought of them. The second set of boot prints told the story in reverse. They returned to tenants from the underthing. They moved the tables, shelves, and out the other door. They made a circle of sorts. A circuit. They were not new boot prints. Still, they told a story that Ari did not love. Told a story she did not want to see repeated. She drew a breath to calm herself. There was no time for this. They'd be coming, all hard boots and arrogance, and not one bit of proper knowledge of the place. Cold sweat swept the prickle heat all off her skin. She drew another calming breath and focused. Her expression fierce, Ari took a deep breath and crossed the threshold into tenants. She placed her small white foot inside the black print of the boot. Her foot was small enough that this was no hard thing. And so she moved with slow deliberation. Her second step brought little more than her toes in contact with the floor. Her feet fit easily inside the boot prints, making no marks of their own. Thus she moved, one delicate step at a time. First to a shelf. She eyed containers before picking up a heavy bottle with a ground glass stopper. Next she took a brush and felt the bristles with her finger. Then she made her way back to the door. Her steps as slow and graceful as a fawn's. She closed the door behind her, then, breathing out a sigh of relief, she ran herself to Rubric. Even moving slowly, it took an hour to find the proper place. Rubric's round brick tunnels ran the length and breadth of Underthing. Miles and miles of passages, twisting up and down and doubling back, taking the pipes where they needed to go. Just as she was fearing she might never find it, just when she had begun to fear it might not be in Rubric after all, Ari heard a sound like angry snakes in rain. If not for that, it might have taken her all day to track it down. She followed the noise until she smelled damp upon the air. Finally, turning a corner, she saw water bursting like a fountain from a cracked iron pipe. The spray had wet the bricks for 20 feet in each direction, and the other pipes were dripping with it too. Tiny brass pipes for pressed air didn't mind in the least. The fat black piss pipe thought the whole thing was rather funny, but the steam pipe was not best pleased. Its thick wrapping was soaked straight through, and it was crumbling and steaming, filling the tunnel with a musty hothouse damp. From where she stood, Ari eyed the dark line of the broken black iron pipe, carefully tracing it through the others. Thoughts held high, she walked away from the leak, following the dark pipe backward. After 10 minutes and a quick detour through tenors, Ari found the valve, a small wheel barely big enough for both her hands. Setting down her brush and bottle, she gripped it tight and twisted. Nothing. So she brought the handkerchief out of her pocket, wrapped it round the wheel, and tried again, teeth bared with the effort. After a long moment, the ungreased edge of it gave way, and grudgingly let itself be spun. She gathered up her tools and headed back. There was no sound of snakes. spray had stopped, but the entire tunnel was still sodden. The air hung wet and heavy, making her hair stick and cling to her face. Ari sighed. It was just as Master Mandrag had said so many years ago. She walked back where the tunnel floor was dry and sat cross-legged on the bricks among the pipes. Then came the hardest part. The waiting grit at her. She had so much to do. This was important, certainly, but he was coming on the 7th day. She was nowhere near to ready. She heard something in the distance, some echo of a sound. A scuff, a step, the sound of boots. Ari went startled and still. She closed her hand over Foxen and sat all quiet in the sudden dark, straining to hear. But no, there was nothing. The underthing was host to 1,000 small moving things. Water in pipes, went through billows, the rumbling thrum of wagons filtering through the cobblestones, half-heard voices echoing down the grates. But no boots. Not now. Not yet. She uncovered Foxen and went to look at the leak again. The air was still hot and thick with wet, so she went back to her sitting place where there was nothing to do but fidget and worry. Ari considered running back to fetch the brazen gear. Then at least she would have company. But no, she had to stay. The leak was bad, but a leak might go unnoticed for some time. Now, with the water to this piece of pipe turned off entire, there was every chance that something vital up above was all lack. No knowing what, the pipe could lead to some disused piece of mains, where it could stay dry for years with no one anyways the wiser. But perhaps it led to the master's hall. Right now one of them was halfway through a bath. What if it led to Crucible and some experiment left to Colmy Kelsenhute was instead undergoing unintended exothermic full cascade? It led to the same thing. Upset. Folk finding keys, folk opening doors, strangers in her underthing, shining their unseemly lights about, their smoke, the braying of their voices, trumping everywhere with hard, uncaring boots, looking at everything without a single thought of what a look entails, poking things and messing around without the slightest sense of what was proper. Arya realized her fists were knots of knuckle white. She shook herself and stood. Her hair hung lank around her head. The air was cleaner now, not wet and steaming anymore. She gathered up her tools and was glad to see the steam pipe had finally roasted both itself and everything around it dry. Better still, the slow regard of silent things had wafted off the moisture in the air. I brought Foxen close to the black iron pipe, and was relieved to see that the trouble was no greater than a hair-thin crack. Though the pipe looked dry, she wiped it with her wet handkerchief. Wiped it again. Then she unstoppered the bottle, dipped her brush, and spread clear liquid all across the tiny break. Wrinkling her nose at the knife-like smell, Mary dipped her brush again, painting all around the pipe. She grinned and eyed the bottle. It was lovely. Tentacolum was tricky stuff, but this was perfect. Not thick like jam, not thick like water. It clung and stuck and spread. It was full of green grass and leaping and sulfonium, naphtha. Hardly what she would have used, but you couldn't argue with results. The craft employed was undeniable. Soon she had coated the entire pipe around the crack with glistening liquid. She licked her lips, looked up, then worked her mouth and spat delicately on the far edge of the wet. The surface of the tentacellum ripped and grew wider. She reached out a finger and was pleased to find it hard and smooth as glass. Oh yes, whoever wrought and factored this was living proof that alchemy was art. It showed pure mastery of craft. Ari painted 2 more coats, laving all the way around the pipe and for a handspan off beside the hairline crack. Twice more she spat to set and glaze it. Then she stoppered the bottle, kissed it, smiled, sprinted back to turn the water on. Duty done, Ari tended to the brush and headed back to Tennant's. She pressed her ear against the door, listened. She heard a faint... No, nothing. She held her breath and listened. Nothing. Even so, she opened the door slowly. She looked inside to see there was no light around the other door. For a moment, her heart stuttered at the thought she saw new footprints on, but no. Just shadow, just her own breath-catching fear. Carefully, she put the bottle back on its shelf, setting it inside its own dark, dustless ring where she had found it. Then, with a brush, she carefully stepped inside the big black brutish treadings of the boots. She wasn't one for rucking things about. She stepped the way the water moves within a gentle wave. Never mind the motion, the water stays unchanged. That was the proper way of things. She slowly closed the heavy door behind her. She checked the latch to make herself more certain sure. Stepping back into the other thing, the stones should have been sweet beneath her feet, but they were not. They were mere stones. The air seemed strange, strained. Something was wrong. She stopped and listened at the door again. She listened closer, then opened up the door a crack to peer inside. Nothing. She closed the door and checked the latch. She leaned her weight against the door and tried to sigh, but could not find a breath inside her chest. Something was wrong. She had forgotten something. Arya ran back to Rubric, heart stuttering as she turned again. Then turned wrong again. But then she found the valve again. She went down on her knees to make most certain sure that she had turned it open and not closed. She put both hands upon the pipe and felt the tremble of the water running through. Not that then, but still. Had she moved carefully enough? Had she left a smudge upon the floor? Arya sprinted back to Tenants and put her ear against the door. Nothing. She opened the door, then lifted Foxen high so his light shone down onto the dust. Nothing. By now, her skin was all asheen with sweat. She closed the heavy door. She checked the latch and leaned her slender weight against it, pressing with her hands and forehead. She tried to breathe more deeply, but her heart was stiff and tight inside her chest. There was something wrong about the air. The door refused to sit right in its frame. She pressed against it with both palms. She checked the latch. Foxen's light seemed suddenly too thin. Had she moved carefully enough? No. She knew. She listened, then opened up the door and looked again. Nothing. But simply seeing did not help. She knew that seeming wasn't hardly half of things. Something was wrong. She tried, but she could simply not unclench. She could not catch her breath. The stones beneath her feet were nothing like her stones. She needed to go somewhere safe. Despite the stones, the strangeness in the air, Arya started walking back to Mantle. She took the safest way, but even so, her steps were slow. And even so, she sometimes had to stop and close her eyes and merely breathe. But even so, the breathing hardly helped. How could it when the air itself had gone untrue? The angles were all wrong in Pickering, but she didn't realize how lost she had become until she looked around and found herself in Scaberling. She did not know how she'd come to be so out of place, but there was no denying where she was. The damp was all around, the smell of rot, the grit under her feet, the way the walls were leaning. She turned and turned again, but could not find her place. She tried to push ahead. She knew that if she walked and turned and walked, eventually she must leave Grim, gritterly scaperling behind. She would come out into a friendly place, or at least the place did not twist and cramp and loom all around her. So she walked and turned and looked around, hoping beyond hope for a glimpse of the familiar, hoping that the stones might slowly start to belong underneath her feet. But no, the hammer of her heart told her to run. She needed her safe place. She needed to get back to Mantle. But where was the way of it? Even if she knew the way, the air was growing tight and dizzy all around her. Though she was loath to touch them, Ari stretched her hand to lean against the sharp unkindness of the wall. Slow steps. A turn. She smiled to see things open up ahead of her. Finally. Her chest began to loosen up when she finally saw the end of Scaperling ahead. She took 2 steps before she realized what way it offered out. She stopped. No. No. The way of unwelcome tunnel opened up ahead. But it opened out into the vast and empty quiet of black door. Arya did not even turn around. She merely stepped back after slow and sliding step, back the same way she had come. It was hard. The wall caught at her hand and worried it, scraping skin off of her knuckles. The damp, tight knot of Scaperling did not want her back inside. The black door did. The wide and welcome path to black doors stretched before her like a dark, black, open mouth. A maw. A maw. Step after step, she forced her way backward into Scaperling. She did not dare to let her way back to the black door out of sight. She did not dare let it behind her, all unseen, unseemly, all unseamed. Finally, she backed around a corner and sat trembling to the floor. She needed everything to come all apart around her. She needed to get back to Mantle. She needed her most perfect place. There the stones were safe under her feet. There everything was sweet, proper true. She was dizzy and askant and slant. She shook and could not bring herself to stand. So she folded herself in and sat cross-legged upon the floor. She sat there for a long and silent while. She closed her eyes, she closed her mouth. She covered Foxen with her hand. All small she sat, all still. The grubby dank of Scaperling got in her hair, made it hang heavy. She let her tangleness fall all around her in a curtain, made a tiny space inside. It was a small space just for her. Ari opened her eyes and looked into this tiny, private place. She saw a brave Foxen bravely shining in the shelter of her hands. She uncovered him, and even though his light was thin and thready, the sight of him in this small space made Ari smile. She felt around herself for a true perfect name. Through it took a long and lonesome moment. Finally she felt it there. It was shivering and scant, scared, skint, but just around the edges it was still somewhat skinolent. It was still hers. It shone. Moving slowly, Ari stood and made her slow way out of Scaperling. The air was thick and shuddersome. The walls were full of spite. The stones begrudged her every step. Everything was snarling all apart, but even so she found her way to Pickering. The walls were merely sullen here. Then she made her way to Dunning's. Then Ari finally felt the stones of Mantle underneath her feet. She lightly stepped back inside her own most perfect place. She washed her face and hands and feet. It helped. She sat for a long moment in her perfect chair. She enjoyed her perfect leaf. She breathed a lovely ordinary air. Her skin no longer felt stretched tight. Her heart grew buttery and warm. Foxen was full scent again, even elephant. Ari went to Van and brushed her hair until the damp and tingle were all gone. She drew her breath and sighed it out. Her name was sweet inside her chest. All things were in their proper place again. She grinned.